people just think they know, right? And they don't realize that knowledge, at least for the human being, at least in my humble estimation, has to be coupled with its other resource, which is confusion, doubt, ignorance, the abyss, the void, the unlimited, because otherwise we're not actually flexing the full intellectual part of ourselves.
There's that great line in Joan of Arc by Bernard Shaw where Joan of Arc is being questioned by the Inquisitor, and he said, some people say that you're just imagining these voices. And she said, yes, how else can God speak to us except through our imagination?
Today, in lieu of moving on with the discussion, we had planned on dreams and mathematics, things like this. We're going to take a small pause and actually get to know one another since Gareth is absent today. And I wanted to take a moment to ask you, who is Greg Shaw, and how did Greg Shaw ultimately come be a professor of religious studies, one who identifies with a Neoplatonic worldview, who also feels compelled to go down East Asian religious traditions. But to do that, I would like to ask, what was Greg Shaw like as a boy?
I was just it's interesting, and I'll try not to go overboard in details here, but as a boy, that's kind of easy. I was just a dreamy kid. I like to play in the mud and water and in the sandbox and, fantasize about soldiers doing things in the sandbox. And that's pretty much it. Read comic books about X-Men and Spider-Man. And, I was your typical kid in the Midwest. And I was lucky enough to be coordinated, and I was a pretty good runner and a good bike rider, and had a reasonably comfortable family scene. There was always, this tension. We all know what that's like in the homes we grow up in, but it was reasonable. We didn't get beaten as children. Well, some people do, and they survive it. So I was a fairly naive, gullible kid. And that's pretty much it. And I didn't really change that much. I mean, I went through junior high, which is, there's a lot of changes that take place then. I think it's a little easier for guys than girls. That's just my perception, because I have two sisters, and I saw how tortured it was for them. And my sense is that guys can be rough, but it's all based on if they're going to beat you up or not. And, you know what the rules are, and you just try to not get beat up. And, I was able to do that by, with my wit and joking around and sometimes being able to run away. Well, girls, it's a little different. But I won't go into that because I never had to worry about it because I wasn't a girl. But I think it's kind of hard for girls to grow up through junior high. And a lot of judgment, a lot of insecurities that get expressed. And in any case, the only thing I had to deal with was fear of getting beat up. Mm-hmm. And I was able to avoid that.
So I know personally that that part of me that makes me a Platonist, even though I would never have identified with it as a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, because I didn't know who Plato was, there's a somehow, to go back to the ion, like a kind of golden thread of a part of my personality that remains even to this day. What would you say about yourself? Like, is there a part of you that you can intuit and remember that is still fundamentally part of your own spiritual worldview today?
Well, yeah, that gets to where it connects to my interest in Neoplatonism and mysticism and spiritual experience. Um, I used to, I mean, I saw a couple of movies as a kid, like The Row with Victor Mature, I believe, playing some some guy who got the robe of Jesus, and it was, all that religious stuff. And I was completely pulled in to this. That there's another world, and there's a higher order, and there's a kind of a holiness that can be manifested in a human being. And I was moved by that as a kid. I thought that was really, really, really cool. I mean, not so much that I would talk about it, but I felt it. Um, and let's see, where the thread that leads to Neoplatonism kind of began when I was a senior in high school. And I somehow began to feel a little bit less connected to some of the stuff that people would do, which was kind of, go out and drink and make a lot of noise and do high school boy things. And some of that started to kind of bore me. And I started to read Khalil Gibran, who was this Lebanese poet.
Oh,
And
no. So one of the very few things I have from my father was a collection of Khalil Gibran. And so it was one of those poetry / prophetic texts that felt weirdly like advice from a man I never knew. So,
well, it spoke to my heart. And I didn't even know I had a heart until I started reading Gibran. And he sort of opened me up. And I let myself sort of be filled with that kind of atmosphere. And wasn't just opening me up. It also filled me with a sense of longing for the kind of beauty that he communicated in his stories and poetry. So I began to read Gibran, and but it really wasn't until I went to college my freshman year that things started to open up for me spiritually. Um, and so I'll just skip right to that. And people at that time were getting mantras from Maharishi. He was the guy selling mantras. He was the guru to the Beatles, you may remember.
oh, okay.
Maharishi is, everybody thought he was cool and everything. And I was kind of opposed to it because he charged $35 to get a mantra. And I thought, well, he shouldn't be selling this. But I had a guy in my dormitory hallway who he went and got his mantra. And he couldn't tell me what it was because you were supposed to keep it secret. So what happened for me was I had a dream where I was talking to him, and his name was Skip. And I said, so what's your mantra, Skip? And at that point in the dream, everything changed. And as soon as he started to say what his mantra was, the voice that came out of him came out of everything. And it was this resonant, like one of those resonant, vibe sounds that filled every atom, including my body, his body. It wasn't just his voice. It was, I guess you could say in corny language, the voice of God or whatever. It was everywhere and in everything. And it was stunning. And so I thought, oh my God, I better get a mantra, because that was powerful. Mhm. And dreams subsequently became a medium through which I was turned on and opened up. I got my mantra and I started to meditate. And what I discovered was that meditating opened something up in me. And it took me to a deep place. And it was almost like I was being addicted to a drug. And the meditation allowed the drug to come into me. And it gave me a sense of bliss and a sense of power that I'd never known before. And so I did it more and more. And then I felt like the Maharishi group was a little bit too contrived and controlled. And so I joined another group that summer after my freshman year. It was going through town and it had some yogis that were dressed in orange and they were giving out mantras and for free. And I thought, well, that's good. And then later that summer, they had a retreat where people from all over the United States came, and it was a place in Kansas. Um, and so, all right, got that mantra, and I started to meditate with it, and put it in simplest language. I just got stoned when I meditated. I really got really stoned.
To
And
clarify, did you actually get cannabis or you were
no,
just stoned
no,
off meditation?
I wasn't smoking pot. I, I had smoked pot a little bit, but not much. And I found it to be really a powerful substance. But no, I wasn't smoking any pot, but the meditation stoned me. I think that's the best way to describe it. It put me in a deeply altered state that was kind of blissful. And I went to this retreat in Kansas. And when I got there, I saw all of these people that were completely stoned out. I thought, oh my God, these are my people. These people are totally into the very kind of thing that I most resonate to and want. So I started doing a lot of yoga and a lot of meditation. I went to college for one more semester and dropped out um, because I thought, what's the point? I'm not going to get enlightened at college. It was just boring lecture classes. And I decided that the best thing to do would be to go to India and go to the ashram where the guru lived. And so I bought a ticket. And before I left, the guru had been put in jail for 13 counts of murder.
No.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
what?
know. And I have no idea what the details are, whether he actually did the murders or facilitated them or whatever. He never really became much of a functioning guru after that. Um,
Would think not.
um, his name was Ananda Murti, and the group I joined was Ananda Marga, which means the path of bliss. So really early on in my, movement towards Neoplatonism, I was a full-blown yogi. That's what I was doing. Um, and I became their missionary. They sent me to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I became the Ananda Marga missionary. And they even gave me a Hindu Sanskrit name, Ganesha, which meant Lord of the Gunas, which are the three qualities of the universe. And I didn't really like that name because I thought it sounded too much like my own name. I wanted something a little more exotic. I thought he was kind of cheating, just gave me a name just like mine, But these people were a little bit, what I would call not cerebral at all. And I was hungry for a little bit more intellectual experience. I guess in the yoga tradition, there's the bhakti yogis, which are the devotional types. And then there's the Raja yogis, which are the more intellectual types. And I had more of an intellectual hunger to express my spirituality. So I ended up, it was a little bit of a detour, which it's not really relevant to Neoplatonism, but for a while I started to follow a guy named Stephen Gaskin, who was known as the acid guru. He was I never took acid either, but I really liked the way he wrote, and he was able to put yogic ideas into accessible form. And I got drafted at that time because I had dropped out of college. And I decided to go underground and went to his commune in Tennessee, and then realized that I didn't want to be there. I was a little bit, I guess somebody might say I was crazy at that time. Well, I wouldn't call it crazy, but somebody else might. Um, when I was at his commune, I heard a voice quietly say in my head, "Oh, so you're going to Arizona?" And I thought, okay, that's what I should do. I, I trusted the voices that I heard. And I had been at Arizona State as a freshman, and I decided to go back there and do my conscientious objector status work in Phoenix and go back to Arizona State University and become a student, which I eventually did. And once I started to take classes, I really liked thinking, and I became quite a good student. When I dropped out, I had a 2.04 grade point average, which I think is a C minus. And when I got back, I had a 4.0. You know, everything I did was A's because I was all turned on. I was mentally geared and alive and awake. And so just to take one more step before we move to whatever else you'd like to pursue. And when I was in the library at Arizona State, I found some of the translations of Thomas Taylor, of the commentaries on Proclus and on Plato. And I started to read Taylor and I thought, oh my God, all this stuff is in the Western tradition. All this deep spiritual material that I found in yoga and in Eastern stuff is in the Western tradition, but I never knew it. I always associated Plato with boring and dry intellectuality, which for some people it is. But obviously, reading Thomas Taylor's translations, it was a lot more than that. It was a deep thing. Reading Proclus, I mean, these guys were, you know, like they were Khalil Gibran style writers. They were beautiful, deep. And so that started getting me turned on to Platonism. I thought maybe that's my ticket. Maybe that's what I should pursue. So that was a turning point.
And then, of course, you did pursue it, right?
Yeah, I did. Uh-huh.
And so it started in your undergraduate life, but as a non-traditional student. How did it turn into a vocation?
Well, in graduate school, I went to UC Santa Barbara, and that was a really good experience. There were good teachers. It was very intellectually exciting. These people took religion very seriously, and there were lively discussions and seminars. I had really some great professors. One of them was Raimundo Panikkar, who is pretty much internationally recognized kind of guru figure. And because he was sort of a guru figure, they didn't really like him in the department because you're not supposed to be a guru in an academic. But I took a lot of different classes, and then I finally took a class on religions in the Roman Empire, and had a good professor who suggested that I read Iamblichus's On the Mysteries and E.R. Dodd's Critique of Theurgy at the end of Greeks and the Irrational. And I'd had a background experience of chanting mantras in the desert when I was in Arizona. And they had the same effect on me as that dream experience of listening to that guy give me his mantra of Om that filled the whole everything. And sometimes when I would chant these mantras, I had the experience of being chanted, so that the mantra filled up the whole landscape, and I was that. And so I knew something that was very powerful about that practice. So when I read Iamblichus on the Mysteries, I realized that he understood exactly what I had experienced, and he described it. The names of the gods are realities. They have the power. We don't. We're not calling on them, but we make ourselves accessible to their power and let it flow through us. That was what he called theurgy. I thought, well, God, he's got a name for it. He described it. I thought, that's very cool. Then I read E.R. Dodd's Critique, and I thought, Dodd didn't know this. He'd never experienced that. He was reading it as an intellectual and critiquing it based on his expectations of what an intellectual should say and do. And so that's really where it began. I wrote a paper criticizing E.R. Dodds, and I've been criticizing ever since. But he's probably one of the greatest scholars probably who ever lived. And he did the translation of The Elements of Theology by Proclus. And even though Dodds was opposed to some of the strangeness of the Neoplatonic stuff, he was also deeply attracted to it. I mean, and I think he was of two minds. He was an Irishman, and he had a job of being the Oxford Regis Professor of Classics. And so, as that English Oxford person, he had to make sure that his crazy Irish side didn't show. So I think that he was kind of overcompensated among his tight, British colleagues to look as rational as possible. But and he did. I mean, he really slammed theurgy and Iamblichus, said it was nothing but superstition, a degradation of the great Platonic tradition. And I thought, he's coming down too hard. And
I tend to think I think of the Greeks and the irrational, right? Like where it's almost his diagnosis of historical irrationality, mysticism, as, a byproduct of an age of anxiety or, trying to grasp control. When you described him, as this Irishman who's trying to, hide the crazy, it's like, yeah, that comes out in your writing, where you're seeing a problem in your own life and this is a classic projection, right?
yeah,
That doesn't mean I don't learn from it, right? Like,
no, he's fantastic. He's one of the smartest and most articulate scholars out there.
yeah.
And
And
very imaginative too.
yeah, and very much detail oriented, which is what gets me that's what makes my light turn on, is that those small little details that people pass over as not relevant, right? So that when somebody reads the Iamblichus and you get to the, divine names and things like this, all the small little details are what cracks things open versus like these sweeping claims that a lot of authors, put out there, but they don't provide the rabbit hole directions, so to speak. And so in any case,
It's funny how that works. It's funny how that'll open us up and we didn't even expect it to happen.
so
He
you're like,
wrote a book called what's it called? Missing Persons, which is his autobiography. And in that he describes his history in his life of pursuing the occult and the paranormal. And he spent a lot of time visiting mediums in Germany and throughout Europe, because that was kind of the thing that was happening at the turn of the century then. And a little bit later, he was a member of the Psychical Research Society. In fact, he was even the president of it. So he was very interested in the paranormal, but he wanted to do it. He wanted to pursue it in a rational kind of way.
so interesting because I'm thinking with regards to my own life as an academic, your life as an academic, his life as an academic. There seems to be something about being drawn to these ancient worlds, but then also having to live in a contemporary, milieu where, in some sense, to go back to your boyhood, we have to play a superhero part, right? Like where, we're Clark Kent in the university life, and then Superman in our own meditative, spiritual, desiring lives. Would you say that that's true? That even we,
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting that you put it that way. And I wonder, I'd like to know how you experienced it, because I definitely experienced it too. But how did you deal with it? I mean, can you give me a sense, a concrete sense of how you sort of like felt the tension between your super normal sort of experience and then having to play a graduate student role in
well, I mean, to go back to another thing that you said, there's something about the feminine experience that I believe has its own kind of loneliness, because it's not just that you're having to hide your woo-woo, but it's also you have to play the part of the woman who's overcoming their femininity and their emotions, and doing, you're becoming the proper kind of student, but it also means you're becoming, more like a man, right? And that was part of the game, I believe, of graduate school, was, presenting as, I can do this. And so it wasn't just that I was studying Plato and Neoplatonism and Nietzsche and for my own growth, but also to get this degree, so that I could go on and, support my family, so on and so forth. And that's kind of an accomplishment when you're one of like two women within a program of 30 guys, right? And so that plays into it. But as far as like holding, like to get specific, I sometimes describe it as if I checked it at the door for a while, that I had to, and I knew I had to, that there was a part of me when I was younger that I indulged in and embraced and loved, and then I didn't trust it. Once I became aware that there was a whole slew of people out there that just made things up, right? And this kind of fictional world that some people were choosing to live in, rather than, the deep dive into the facts of the matter, if you will. And so it's almost,
This is really critical. This is a critical piece here that you're talking about. So you felt the depth of your own story, call it story or myth, and it was real and it was valid. But then you saw other people presenting theirs, and it seemed really schlocky and not really legit. And so you began to wonder, how can I bring substance to my story so that it doesn't end up being like one of those self-deluded people?
so to
Not
be,
easy.
no, it's not easy at all. To be concrete, my mother thought I had some sort of prophetic gift, so she would have me read people's palms. And when I was around 9 or 10, I started to want to distance myself from doing things like this, both because the people I was reading their palms for would get really upset or scared if I was too on the nose. And then I also knew that it was coming from my imagination. I mean, flash forward 35 years later, I now trust my imagination. It's not just the imagination. But 10-year-old Danny started to have that kind of, oh, I'm making things up, right? I'm like this person who's also has no substance. And so this kind of reflective, like, oh, maybe I should doubt this ability. Also because I knew that my mom wore religion like a handbag, right? She would change her spirituality depending upon who she was with. And so there was a kind of also seeing that there wasn't a stability to my paradigm for spirituality and faith.
Which would have been helpful for you if she had just been a Greek Orthodox woman, and then and you could have put it all into some sort of Greek Orthodox frame and felt secure, but you didn't have that.
Right. And so, like I said, I think I checked it at the door, and I would say she always kind of stayed, but more as an observer as I worked through my graduate career, and then the first half of my career as an academic in the university world. But then eventually I felt safe enough as a established scholar with a, good enough job to be able to explore that world again in an authentic way. Part of that was meeting people like you and Sarah, and others who could hear, even in my academic papers, the ring of the more than, wanting to support me in exploring that more. And so, yeah, I mean, so yeah, how did you end up feeling comfortable just, being, because not many people do what we do, which is to say we are Platonists, right?
Yeah.
Normally it's we teach Platonism. That's my expertise. When did you start feeling comfortable saying, I am a Platonist?
I was comfortable saying that before I got a job at the college that I taught at for 35 years. Because it's a Catholic college, and they kind of wanted to know if I was Catholic, and they didn't want to ask me straight out because it was an interview process. But I told them that I'm a Pythagorean, and I'm a Platonist, and then I kind of lit up when I talked about it. And what to their great credit, and I grew to really appreciate Catholics a lot more after I went there, is that they were attracted to the way I lit up when I talked about Plato and Pythagoras, more than they were concerned about it being Plato and Pythagoras. They were attuned to the energy and the opening that they felt from me when I talked about them, Plato and Pythagoras. So, wins. But I never had the reading palms kind of background that you did, which is kind of interesting.
I never had the guru experience. So,
Well, you mean meeting a guru?
well, like I envy your early life because you got on that plane to see the guru. You went to different spiritual teachers. You were committed to finding that pathway at an early age, and
Yeah, I was too.
so that
I get it. I get it. That, yeah, well, and those days it was in the air too, more. It was 1972.
Sure.
And people were, following gurus and hitchhiking, literally, looking for enlightenment. And, but the point that you're getting at is finding that deep, call it wisdom, or some sort of, unspoken wisdom that you tapped into as a little girl and thinking, well, I'm just imagining it. But in fact, yes, you were imagining it, but it also was connected to something deeper. I mean, there's that great line in Joan of Arc by Bernard Shaw, where Joan of Arc is being questioned by the Inquisitor, and he said, some people say that you're just imagining these voices. And she said, yes, how else can God speak to us except through our imagination? And I think that's the answer to, what you were thinking. But it's the question of quality of the imagination. Why are some people's imagination so self-absorbed and kind of boring? I mean, there's people who just don't seem to have a very, I mean, who are we to say who's got a good visionary story and who doesn't? But it comes down to that. You are able to translate your visionary tendencies into a tradition that accepted that the visionary is part of what it is to be a Platonic philosopher. And thankfully, you found a tradition that included intellectual depth with visionary depth. And so you were able to start swimming in those waters and keep your visionary stuff alive and express it through your intellectual work. Well, not everybody has the opportunity of finding themselves in a Platonic tradition. And so these are people who are visionaries, but don't have the intellectual context that can ground them and give it substance. That's what it did for me.
can I ask you about that? Like, so here, because when I think about, it's almost as if I needed to check my relationship to my own spirituality and my own journey, if you will, down that particular path, because I needed to discipline. I needed to learn how to basically, I needed to work out my intellectual muscle, right? I needed to give it more substance. I needed to be able to draw from a deeper well, if you will. And, part, like you described your time in libraries. For me, I know what my time in the University of Leuven's library, sitting in those stacks as if books were whispering me to internalize them. And there's no air conditioning. It's hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and like the tactile nature of just sitting in front of all of these books, mini books I don't even know the authors of. I was just interested in what they were saying, and yeah, but it felt like if I look back on it as part of who I am now, I would say I didn't check it because I didn't trust it, but there was some part of me that said, this is what you have to do now. You have to work out, so to speak. You have to do that. Did you ever have an experience where you felt as if you were putting aside the consequences for your own life for the sake of giving yourself, mm, letting yourself be objective as an exercise. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure exactly, but I think what you're asking is, how did I ever decide that I was on this mission, so to speak, or that, I mean, um, I, when I was in Boston, and I went to Boston because it was on my way to India when I was going to do that. And then I got a job in a hospital trying to do, conscientious objector work. And, I remember having a dream when I was in Boston, and, it was just this incredibly powerful dream, where the lightning bolt, kind of came down and hit me after I had seen this, you know, sculpture of an eagle. But the experience I had was, now I know why I was born. And I knew it as clear as a bell. Now I know why I was born. And it was connected to following that light, that vision, that experience. And I didn't know how it unfold, but it was like I knew that um, I was stamped from on high, you could say. And I know that that sounds kind of like a madness, but I didn't tell anybody, about it. Um,
The not telling. So you also talked about, you're not telling the mantra, right? Uh, for me, the not telling is also part of the vocation of it, right? There seems to be like a necessary secret to
yeah,
living this Platonic life.
interesting. Yeah, that's worth pursuing.
Mhm.
What's the role of carrying a secret? And I think somewhere in Jung's autobiography, he talks about the importance of carrying a secret, and that it sort of has a transformative power, um, and it's connected to how you become truly an individual in a deep sense. But yeah, I knew I was on a mission from God, you could say, and I didn't know how it would unfold, but I believed in it, and it seemed like things were working out. Um,
You
I
know,
was pretty I was pretty, uptight. I mean, I didn't have any relationships. I was a celibate. I was a yogi still. But go ahead. You were about to say
oh no,
something?
no, I wanted you to just elaborate on that a little bit more, right? Like this, you almost hesitated to use the word God when you said on a mission from and God.
Sure.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
could you elaborate on, why it's hard to say something like that?
Because it sounds so, inflated.
Mm.
Sounds like an ego inflation. And in a way it is an inflation, but maybe it's necessary. I don't know. But yeah, I'm wary. I'm particularly wary of people who think they're really, really important in that way. And and I think that if you don't have that kind of context, that sort of, either it's a community that can give you the context to kind of ground you, or an intellectual tradition that you're part of that can ground you, um, that the inflation can become sort of stupid inflation. Like this guy I met when I was in Arizona, in a spiritual group. Um, he came to our group because we used to let people come in and hang out with us and stuff. And he told us all he was called Love 22.
Mm.
And he was an okay looking guy, and he had a guitar. He had several women with him. So it was Love 22 with his entourage of women. And okay, so he talked to us. And then he said that he realized that he was Jesus come again. And I loved that. I thought, okay, this guy's one really stupid mother. And I said, that's kind of was kind of mean. I've always been kind of mean that way. And I said, well, how is it that you know that you're Jesus? Because I thought he might say something that would be interesting. He said, well, above the cross, there are the letters INRI. And are you familiar with that? Yeah. Yeah. He said, I was born in Rhode Island. And I thought, dude, we've all smoked weed, we've all had these crazy thoughts, but in the morning, you kind of just have to think about it.
Yeah.
Um, so there's people like that. I was born in Rhode Island. I didn't want to be that kind of on a mission from God or an emissary of God. But I do really believe that there are angelic presences and that we can that depending on how we're functioning, that we can mediate them. And I know I just used the word angelic presences, like I'm evoking some sort of tradition, but people who are heavily into like Tibetan Buddhism, they're comfortable with that kind of idea. They think that people transmit stuff. And I've talked to psychics who will will explain to me they see my guides and this and that. But it's not your ordinary conversation. You don't go into graduate school and say, yes, I have an angelic guide and I'd like to work here. No, they don't want you there. They don't want people with angelic guides. They want somebody who's going to do the hard work. And I want them to be that way because we don't want to be preaching our angelic mission, stories to people. But it, I'm still taken by what you said about trying to integrate your visionary side with the intellectual side, and that you found a tradition that accepted the visionary, but also required a kind of an Elenchus to straighten your head up so that you didn't get it wrong. And it's that Socratic dimension that Platonism has that keeps us from being stupid messiahs, you know?
That's what I think is absolutely fundamental. Like I was thinking this just as you were talking about your Rhode Island guy, right? It's the integrating the beauty of the doubt, right? The beauty of looking at it from a different perspective, the beauty of turning it upside down or going in a new direction. I mean, this is why I so appreciate Plato, where, he'll write one dialogue that makes it look like Socrates is rejecting Parmenides but at the end of the day, another dialogue where it's clear that he's, at his knees, learning. And so that, we see this kind of multidimensional, various different characters taking on this philosophical life. And where we go wrong is when we become too much like a Protagoras, right? Where like, here, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Listen to my stories and I'll get you set right. That kind of, and I think also my own personal disdain of that in my day-to-day life, where people just think they know, right? And they don't realize that knowledge, at least for the human being, at least in my humble estimation, has to be coupled with its other resource, which is confusion, doubt, ignorance, the abyss, the void, the unlimited, because otherwise we're not actually flexing the full intellectual part of ourselves. We're just
So
flexing.
I want to ask you, when you started to write articles, and I remember reading one of your articles years ago, and I may have told you that my experience was when I read it, I thought, God, thank God I can die now, because somebody definitely gets it and gets it the way I get it, and believes it and is able to articulate it. And you were writing about, what it's like to be in the cave and yet feeling the presence of the divine despite being in the cave. And it was just it was the way that you wrote it that that uh, revealed that you were being carried by something deeper than just kind of.
Well, I mean, I think I've told you this before. The first time I read Theurgy and the Soul, and keep in mind, I'm in graduate school at the time, or just graduated, but still in Leuven. I felt like the same as when I read Pierre Hadot for the first time, which is, this like, oh, there are scholars out there that are doing something that I could only dream to achieve, which is, write in such a way that you communicate to the intellectual the rich content, while at the same time having that whisper of, but this is fundamental for my life, right? This should be fundamental for your life as well. Come in and see how mathematics does this. Come in and see how prayer isn't petition, right? Like all of these like hints of the person that had gone through a journey to write the theurgy and the soul, that it wasn't just an intellectual project, but your own need and compulsion to show people that this could be made relevant now, that it isn't something dead and in the past. And so,
And this is something people already know, and they're longing to have somebody give expression to it. And one of the best compliments I've ever gotten from different people is that sometimes they feel that if they read something that I wrote, that it was what they knew, but finally somebody was saying it in the way that they could identify with, and it empowered them in their own tradition and in their own practice. And I think that's one of the things that those of us who work with the Platonic tradition can aspire to do, is to give expression to a tradition that's intellectually at the very core of Western civilization, but that also espoused a kind of beautiful, artistic, spiritual understanding of what it is to be a human being. And I think that's what you sense in the tradition, and that's where you write from. That's what's driving you. And Sarah, she's got those thunderbolts of Zeus that she's got to carry around with her. She has no choice. She has to do it. She's tortured by it. It doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make life easy. It doesn't make relationships easy.
no, I
But
mean, I remember, so, you've talked about your dream, and I remember Sarah's dream. I believe she was in college as well. But I experienced my first instance of sleep paralysis during college, which, for those of you who don't know, sleep paralysis is when your
no, I
body,
do.
yeah,
Go ahead, tell it them.
yeah,
So
your body
for
releases
people,
chemical to where your body is asleep, but your mind is still awake, and you experience wherever you've fallen asleep as real as, you know, but then there's this foreboding feeling, sometimes figures, so on and so forth. And I learned to overcome this condition of sleep paralysis. At the time, I didn't know what it was, so I thought I was going a little crazy because I would talk to people about these sleep paralysis experiences. Thank goodness I read some Descartes and had that, somebody else has experienced this body-mind dualism. But long of the short of it is that I also started having dreams much like Sarah and what you have described. And I remember once I fell asleep on the floor of my living room watching some television show, and the depth of feeling this light, like the tunnel kind of, your typical, description of a near-death experience, where there was
yeah,
beautiful light right at the top of my ceiling, and there was a tunnel. But what I remember most is not the light and the images, because it was the sound of of a music so glorious that, like you said, it was from then on out. Like I knew that there was something more than it, and
yeah.
I can still hear the notes to this day. And I love that this about Platonism, where it helps you understand that there's a sight without seeing, there's a hearing without the ear, right? There's a voice without vocal cords, just in the same way that when you close your eyes and you meditate, you can experience depth and color and all of the things that we experience in the sensible reality. But there's an intelligible version of all of those things too. And I think that's what we tap into when we really let our imagination explore all the things that it knows, right? So I know that my meditative practices, now that I, you know, let myself contemplate, say, a dodecahedron or, whatever cube I want, that it helps direct my mind to. So if I had never gone to college, if I had never, done graduate work, if I had never studied Platonic mathematics, I don't know if my meditative world would have become so intense to where I can hear that angelic song in a
Mm.
totally different way than I did when I was 21 and first had that experience. And so,
It makes me think, as you're describing all of this, that if you've got this experience and you've had, and, I think there's some degree of kind of being born with, a tendency, a capacity, but that it got developed and then it got contextualized in this Platonic tradition that it gives you a kind of a responsibility in a way to share this with people in our culture who are hurting really bad. And it's not necessarily obvious hurting, but it's a kind of a soul sickness
Yeah.
of not feeling connected to that music in their own life. And I mean, I understand why people are drawn to the use of psychedelics and so on to connect them to that, because that might be a way of jumpstarting people out of that malaise that they're in. But then they still need the discipline of the intellectual tradition, like Platonism, that says, yes, we recognize that the visionary is important, but we need to have the Elenchus, which questions how you make sense of it, and and when you make sense of it, and how you communicate it to yourself even. But you've got this for yourself, and you've got the responsibility of trying to open up students, which you're doing, to develop their own capacity to do this. And you don't expect them to do it the same way you did it,
Oh, of
because
course not.
nobody's
Yeah.
going to do it the same way you did it. And that's why difference is really important. That's why it's important that Platonism doesn't have a dogma, and that there isn't one way of understanding what the Platonic tradition is. I mean, there's certain basics. I mean, Socrates represents a certain kind of basic approach of questioning that's important. But then there's the visionary too. And that we can't really know when that's going to happen.
So since we're talking, so I agree with you, as you well know, that there is not a dogmatic, as Earl Fontenelle is happy to quote John Dillon, and Platonism is a broad church, right? That here, for me, that's a fundamental tenet of what it means to be a Platonist, is to be wary of all forms of dogmatism. I also would put on that list of what constitute a Platonist is the immortality of the soul, right? What would you put on that list now, as you think about how it has changed and permeated your own life? Like for me, that's a mainstay, that to understand that Plato's, big jazz hands is immortality of the soul, just as Pythagoras was, so on and so forth.
Yeah. When you mentioned that, what struck me was beauty.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
trust your being drawn to beauty in its richest and deepest expression. And if you do that, immortality of the soul follows, I think.
And this is
But
why I think that Nietzsche, insofar as for him, first philosophy is not ontology or metaphysics, but it's aesthetics, it's taste, right? Like it's being drawn to those great personalities and seeing the beauty in certain personalities in antiquity. And this is, he's not an amoral philosopher. He's actually a moral philosopher. Morality is based upon our taste, right? Our aesthetic judgment of, is this beautiful? And if it is, then yes, affirm it.
yes,
But if we're living in a culture, and so I agree with you that there's a certain responsibility that I have felt my entire life, because I see a sickness, right, in even the happiest people I meet, because the malaise of the mundane, the malaise of living in a culture that says, like Nietzsche would say, that they have discovered happiness, but then they blink, then they, get their yoga pants on and go drink a cup of coffee and experience nothing more than the malaise of their happiness, right? And I'm like, oh, there's something missing. There's a puzzle piece. And for some odd reason, I've always felt compelled to try to give people that puzzle piece, even though I know, as you said, about your own self, about Sarah, about, that there's that missing puzzle piece comes with anguish. That missing puzzle piece comes with, suffering. And so in some sense, it's almost a curse that I want to give to people, but I know it's a curse that deepens, things. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes all the sense in the world. By opening people up to this kind of depth, you're just really going to F them.
Yeah, fuck everybody.
Um, I mean, you are, and that's the best thing that could ever happen to us. Um, we could go through life just, I mean, I love America. I like being in this country. I think it's great. It's got all kinds of cool things, but it doesn't have it doesn't have a deep tradition that you're drawn to and that I'm drawn to, and that I'd like to imagine, say in Renaissance Italy, it was more of a dominant sort of ruling sort of goal for people. And maybe that's just my fantasy of what it was like, but I wish that we had more of a culture
Yeah.
in the world that we're in, and we don't. I mean, I've been to Esalen many times. That place in Big Sur, and it has a lot of things there that I like a lot. But what it doesn't quite have is the deep intellectual context that you got in that cold library in Leuven, and that I got by immersing myself in my incense-filled rooms, reading Helena Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine or something like that, which I did like for hours and hours. I went through a whole Blavatsky stage in my life too.
I don't want to go through a stage like that.
But it was rich. I mean, and I'm thankful for that. Um, but even if you do all kinds of cool things and have written things that you think are say what you want to say, and that people even say they like it or it's whatever, you can still just be back to point zero and in your own malaise. And what I'm trying to do these days is accepting that sadness. There's a sadness with it. And it's a sadness of the human condition, and accept it
Yeah.
and not fight it.
That's why I come when it comes to this, and I'm gonna have to go soon. When it comes to that, I think of
Okay.
and Apollodorus like weeping the entire time, right? That Plato could easily let that be a group of very rational, sober men asking questions, but like he saturated that text with grief, right? So that we wouldn't just read about the death of Socrates and not experience Apollodorus weeping or Xanthippe beating her chest and, leaving, or, you know, the child left behind or the children left behind, or Crito anxiously trying to figure out how to take care of the body. Like we get all of that. And it's beautiful. And to be able to love your sadness, to be able to love your anger, to be able to love your confusion, to wake up, in the morning and have had a great dream and you figured it out. And then it like, dandelion seeds just disappears, right? And that
Mhm.
epiphany is gone. And knowing that that's okay, that that's part of it. And so, at least to me.
We could go on, and there's other
Yeah,
things to say, but I think that we've had a pretty good exchange here.
yeah, me too.